Charleston's medical school bought 23 enslaved people in February 1008, 147, for a price that surprised even the city's rich leaders, nearly 3 times the normal rental cost. The school gave no reason for the high price, and the owners of the people asked no questions. 3 months later, all 23 were sent back. 12 could walk. 7 needed help moving. 4 had stopped talking completely. The college paid every owner fully with large extra payments to keep them quiet, and added one rule to every contract. The people were never to be sold inside South Carolina again. What took place in those 90 days stayed Charleston's best kept secret until one mistake during a midnight operation started events that would show everything to the world. Before we go on with the story of what happened behind the locked doors of Charleston's most famous medical place, make sure you are subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit that bell so you never miss our dark history stories. And leave a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. We love knowing where our group of history fans is watching from. The winter of 1008, 147 in Charleston was very cold, and what happened in that basement would turn out even colder. Charleston in 1008, 147 stood as the prize of Southern life and business, its water filled with trade ships, and its streets lined with fancy houses that showed wealth built on rice, cotton, and owning people. The Medical College of South Carolina, started just 20 years before, sat in a big Greek-style building on Queen Street, where the sons of farm owners learned how to heal along with poor white students looking to move up in the world. Dr. Edmund Carraway had come to the college 2 years before, already bringing a debated name from his time in Philadelphia. At 38, he had the kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw mess, connections where others saw luck. His fellow doctors at Jefferson Medical College had found his ideas about racial bodies interesting but unproven, at least not with the rules Northern society put on medical testing. The South, Carraway thought, offered chances not found anywhere else. Here, the law saw enslaved people as property, subject to their owner's wish. Here, science might finally answer questions that had confused thinkers for hundreds of years. The college itself sat in an uneasy spot in Charleston society. The city's top families sent their sons there, but they also whispered about what happened in the cutting rooms, about the bodies that came in the middle of the night, about the screams that sometimes came from the basement windows. Dean Horace Rutledge claimed that all big medical steps needed sacrifice, that the students needed real practice, that the South must build its own medical skill rather than lean on Northern schools. Most people in Charleston agreed, as long as they didn't look too closely at the ways it was done. Carraway lived in simple rooms near the college, never having married despite his job success. His co-workers found him nice enough in normal talk, but noted his habit of becoming focused on specific questions. For the past year, that question had eaten him up completely. Did the body differences between races go to the nervous system itself? Could pain levels, healing speeds, and fighting disease be measured and compared with science? The fight over these questions burned in medical books and science groups throughout the Western world. Some doctors said that all humans shared basic likenesses, that clear differences came from life conditions rather than biology. Others, mostly in the South, argued that God had made different races with different skills and bodies, that this explained the social order, that science would eventually prove what everyone could clearly see. Carraway believed he could solve the matter for sure with the right study plan. He needed subjects, human subjects from different races, put under the exact same conditions, so that changes could be controlled. He needed animals to compare, to set starting points, and he needed the freedom to run tests that northern schools would never allow. In early January 1847, he showed his plan to Dean Rutledge in the boss's wood, walled office. The study would involve testing pain reactions, healing speeds, and disease fighting across 3 groups: enslaved Africans, monkeys brought from India, and as a control group, white subjects from the city's poorhouse. Caraway had already got money from 3 farm owners interested in the practical uses. If enslaved workers truly felt less pain, it might change medical care and work rules. Rutledge listened with his fingers together under his chin. "The way you want to do this is sound," he said finally, "but we cannot use white subjects, even poor ones. The town would never accept it, no matter the science value. Use only the Negro subjects and the animals. If your idea is right, the comparison should still give good facts." Caraway agreed, though privately he worried about missing a proper control group. He spent the next month getting his lab ready in the college basement, putting in checkup tables, sorting his tools, and planning detailed watching rules. He ordered 12 rhesus monkeys from a seller who brought in strange animals, paying high prices for healthy ones of the same age and size. The enslaved subjects came from different places. Farm owners sent people they thought were hard to handle or extra to their work needs, seeing the study as a chance to earn rental money while getting rid of problems. Others came from the city itself, house servants blamed for stealing, field hands hurt and now seen as less valuable, a woman who tried to run away twice. Caraway paid $50 per person for a 3-month time with no promise of their health. At the end, he gave each a number instead of using their names, writing down only basic facts: guest age, sex, visible health, and where they came from. Number 7 was a woman in her mid-20s from a Combahee River rice farm, sent because she had been caught teaching other enslaved children to read. Number 12 was a man of about 40 who had worked as a blacksmith until an owner's death forced his sale to pay debts. Number 19 was a boy of maybe 15, though Caraway noted that finding exact ages was hard given the lack of papers. The monkeys he marked with letters A through L. He kept them in wire cages in a separate room off the main lab where their cries and chatter made constant noise. The animals got scared easily, throwing themselves against the cage bars when anyone came near. Caraway found their actions interesting. Were they reacting to some built-in knowing of danger, or simply showing the general jumpiness noted in that animal type? By the middle of February, everything was ready. Caraway hired 2 helpers from the older medical students: Robert Gadsden, whose family owned several James Island farms, and Thomas Pinckney, a poor white student from the country who had worked his way into the college through pure will. Both were told to keep detailed notes of every observation, every measurement, every reaction to pain. The college bought the silence of the enslaved people through fear and force rather than agreement. They were told that helping meant better treatment, food, and eventual return to their owners. Fighting meant punishment, moving to worse spots, or sail to the deep south, where conditions were known to be very bad. Most chose to help, at least at first, having learned through hard life that fighting rarely made things better. Carraway started with what he thought were baseline checks, measuring body sizes, looking at teeth and bone shape, testing reflexes and basic reactions. He worked in order, treating the human and animal subjects with the same cold professional way, noting likenesses and differences in his careful writing. Number 7 had strangely long fingers, he noted. Monkey F showed signs of old injury to its left arm. Number 12's teeth showed a harder diet in youth than most of the others. What Carraway failed to see or chose to ignore was the growing feeling of terror in the basement lab. The enslaved people could hear the monkeys screaming. They could see the tools laid out on tables, the leather straps attached to exam beds, the jars of stuff whose uses they could only guess. They could smell the fear, human and animal, that filled the underground space. Number 7 later said in words given decades after that she knew within the first week that many of them would not survive. He had that look, she said, like we wasn't people at all. Like we was just another kind of monkey to him. Maybe a little different, maybe a little same, but nothing that mattered past his numbers and his notes. The real test started on February 23rd, 1008, 147. Carraway's journal note for that day mentions oddly warm weather and his happiness with the setup. Today we start the comparison study for real, he wrote. If it works, this work may change our understanding of human bodies and solve forever the questions that have bothered natural philosophy. He had planned a growing set of tests, moving from simple to complex, from watching to acting. The first week involved pain level checks using measured triggers, pin pricks getting deeper, exposure to heat and cold, pressure put on sensitive spots. Carraway would do identical acts on both a human subject and a monkey, writing down the strength of trigger needed to get a reaction and the kind of reaction. The monkeys screamed at even small pain, fighting against their straps with wild strength. The human subjects, however, often stayed silent even when Carraway raised the strength past what had caused the animals to react. He first saw this as proof of his idea that enslaved Africans had a basically different nervous system, one less sensitive to pain. What he failed to think about or purposely ignored was that the enslaved subjects had learned through years of cruel training that showing pain led to worse outcomes. They had been whipped, beaten, burned, and broken since childhood, taught that crying out brought more punishment rather than help. Their silence was a survival plan rather than a body difference. Thomas Pinckney noticed this, mentioning it to Carraway after the third day of testing. Sir, might we think that these subjects have been trained to hide pain reactions? In my time on the farm, slaves learn fast not to show weakness. Carraway waved away the worry. We are measuring automatic reactions, not learned acts. The nervous system either feels pain or it does not. Keep writing the data as told. By the second week, the tests had gotten worse. Carraway began testing healing speeds by making controlled wounds, small cuts, minor burns, scraped skin, and watching how fast the wounds closed. Again, he did identical acts on both human and animal subjects. The monkey's wounds often got infected despite the fairly clean state of the lab. Several got fevers, requiring Carraway to separate them to stop the spread of sickness to other animals. The human subject's wounds usually healed faster with fewer problems. Carraway noted this with pride, seeing proof of his theory that different races had built-in different body skills. He did not think that the enslaved subjects had immune systems toughened by years of exposure to harsh conditions, poor food, and constant threat of sickness, that their better healing was adaptation rather than a racial trait. Number 12, the former blacksmith, tried to explain this to Pinckney one afternoon, while Carraway was upstairs meeting with the dean. "Sir, we've been healing from hurts our whole lives," he said quietly, his voice raspy from screaming the day before when Carraway had tested his pain reactions with hot tools. "We had to get good at it, or we'd die young. Ain't nothing special about our blood or our skin. We just got practice at living through what would kill softer folk." Pinckney put this thought in his notes, but Carraway dismissed it during their review session that evening. "Biased view from an uneducated subject," he wrote on the side, "not relevant to real measurements." As March arrived, bringing the first hints of the wet heat that would soon cover Charleston, the tests grew more harmful. Carraway began testing reactions to various substances, chemicals, extracts, mixes made from plants known to have healing or poisonous effects. He would give measured amounts to both a monkey and a human subject, then record the effects. Changes in heart beat, breathing, awake state, movement control. Some substances caused violent reactions. Monkey C died after being given a mix of nightshade, shaking for 20 minutes, while Carraway took careful notes on the steps of symptoms. Number 8. A woman in her 30s received the same amount the following day. She lived, though she passed out for several hours and woke up confused, unable to remember her own name for 3 days after. "Interesting difference in tolerance levels," Carraway wrote. "The human subject showed much better fighting against the mix, suggesting basic differences in body processing. Further study needed." What he did not note was that number 8 weighed nearly twice what monkey C had weighed, meaning the relative amount was much lower. Nor did he account for animal-specific differences in how monkey bodies handled various poisons. His way of doing things, for all its neat look, was deeply flawed by ideas he refused to check. The students began to grow uncomfortable with how the experiments were going. Robert Gadsden came from a family that owned hundreds of enslaved people, viewing them as property without second thought. Yet even he found himself bothered by what he saw in the basement lab. The screams that echoed through the stone halls at all hours, the smell of burnt flesh when Carraway tested pain reactions with heated tools, the way some subjects stopped reacting at all, their eyes gone far away and empty. "Is this really needed, sir?" Gadsden asked one afternoon in late March after watching Carraway purposely break Monkey G's finger to test bone healing speeds. "The facts we are getting, does it truly help medical knowledge, or are we simply confirming what any farm boss could tell us?" Carraway looked at him with a cold stare. "What farm bosses know is based on stories and hate. We are doing science, Mr. Gadsden, controlled testing with careful watching and measuring. If you lack the stomach for hard questions, perhaps you should rethink your chosen job." Gadsden said nothing more, but that night he wrote to his father expressing doubts about his continued part in the study. His father's reply arrived a week later. "You will see the work through to the end." The Gadsden name has never been linked with fear or weakness of belief. "Doctor, Carraway's work may prove very valuable to our money interests. Do your duty." So the tests continued. By early April, 3 of the monkeys had died. 1 from the nightshade mix, 1 from infection following a test of surgery wound healing, and 1 from what Carraway called general body failure after weeks of repeated procedures. The human subjects all still lived, though several showed signs of failing health. Number 19, the 15-year-old boy had developed a bad cough. Number 7's hands shook all the time, even when she was trying to stay still. Number 12 had stopped speaking completely, answering questions and orders only with nods or shakes of his head. Caraway noted these changes with cold distance, seeing them as data points rather than proof of pain. His journal entries grew more sure, more convinced that his work would change medical understanding. He began writing a paper to send to the Charleston Medical Journal, outlining his ways and early findings. The title he chose was sharp: Comparative Body Systems of the Negro and Simian Races, a controlled study of pain tolerance, disease fighting, and healing skill. In his opening, he wrote, "Through careful testing, we may finally put aside guessing and establish sure proof that the Creator made different races with basically different skills, each suited to their place in civilization's grand plan." He showed the draft to Dean Rutledge, who read it with growing worry. "Edmund, you must be more careful in your words," the dean advised. "The findings are valuable, but you are making claims that will start fights." Perhaps frame this as early thoughts needing more study. Caraway got angry at the suggestion. "Science needs clarity, Horace. We cannot soften our conclusions simply because they make some uncomfortable." "The data speaks for itself." "The data may speak," Rutledge said carefully, "but we must consider how it will be heard. There are abolitionists even here in Charleston who would grab your work as proof of cruelty. Northern papers would destroy you and by extension this school. Give me time to think how best to show this to the board of leaders." Frustrated but listening to school power, Caraway agreed to delay printing while Rutledge talked with the college's board. This delay would prove important, though not in the way either man expected, because while Caraway waited for permission to tell his findings to the medical world, something was stirring among the human subjects locked in his basement lab. An impossible plan born of desperate situation and the faint hope that perhaps in showing the full horror of what was being done to them, they might save others from the same fate. The turning point came not from the test subjects themselves, but from a surprise source within Charleston's own enslaved group. Samuel, a house servant who worked in one of the college's office rooms, had been emptying trash bins and cleaning floors when he overheard talks that troubled him deeply. He couldn't read the papers he collected, but he recognized names. The names of people he knew from the market, from church meetings, from the invisible web of talk that existed beneath white Charleston's notice. Number 7 was called Dina among her own people. Number 12 was Marcus. Number 19 was James, and Samuel's wife had known his mother before the boy was sold away from the Goose Creek farm where he had been born. Samuel began paying closer attention to the basement activities, listening at doors, watching who came and went, noting the sounds that came out at odd hours. What he learned scared him. He understood that something terrible was happening. Even if he couldn't grasp the full size of Caraway's tests in Charleston's enslaved community, news moved through paths invisible to white eyes. Messages passed through market stalls in church basements during short talks, while getting water or emptying pots. Within a week, several free black residents knew that people were suffering in the medical college basement. Within 2 weeks, that news reached Reverend Morris Brown, one of the city's few remaining black preachers who had somehow kept his place despite tighter laws. Brown faced an impossible choice. Going to white authorities would likely do nothing. Enslaved people had no legal standing to complain about their treatment, and the college's tests, however cruel, weren't technically against the law. The subjects had been rented by their owners for medical uses. And in Charleston in 1847, that deal fell well within accepted ways. But Brown had connections to the small abolitionist group that existed even in the heart of the South. Quakers mostly, some free black professionals, a few white Charlestonians whose conscience wouldn't allow silence. He began carefully, quietly writing down what Samuel and others reported. He needed proof that could shame the college's leaders, make the tests too publicly shameful to continue, even if they couldn't be legally challenged. Meanwhile, in the basement lab, the subjects had begun their own form of fighting back. Number 7, Dina, had noticed that Carraway kept detailed records of everything, writing constantly in his leather journal and in loose sheets filed in folders. She couldn't read, but she understood the power of writing. If they could somehow get those records out of the lab, perhaps someone could use them to show what was happening. The chance came in mid-April when Carraway caught a spring fever, forcing him to miss 3 days of work. He left orders for Gadsden and Pinckney to keep doing basic checks, but to try no new procedures while he was gone. This gave the subjects their first rest in weeks, time when no one was actively hurting them, time when the students were mainly busy with cleaning tools and sorting supplies. Dina had been watching Pinckney for weeks, sensing something different about him, some hesitation that the other student lacked. She decided to risk everything on that feeling. "Sir," she said quietly one afternoon when Pinckney was alone in the room where they were kept between tests, "you got a good heart. I can see it." Pinckney looked at her, surprised. Direct talk between white men and enslaved women was dangerous for both sides, full of meanings and risks. "You shouldn't speak to me," he said, but without strong feeling. "I'm going to speak anyway 'cause I got to," Dina went on, her voice low and urgent. "You been writing in them books, writing everything that happens here. You think what's happening is right. It's science," Pinckney said, but the words came out unsure. "It's torture," Dina replied. "You know it is. You seen what he does to us, what he done to them animals. You seen how some of us ain't right in the head no more. How James don't even cry when the doctor hurts him 'cause something broke inside. You going to write that down too? You going to tell the world that's what science looks like?" Pinckney said nothing, but his hands were shaking. "There's papers," Dina pressed on, "papers that tell everything he done. You could take them. You could show people. I could be kicked out, arrested. My family depends on my success here," Pinckney said, but he was shaking. "And 23 people going to die or go crazy in this basement if you don't do nothing," Dina said. "You got to choose what you can live with, sir. The rest of us don't get that choice." That talk haunted Pinckney for the next week. He tried to focus on his regular schoolwork, on the body lectures and chemistry shows that filled his days above ground. But at night he dreamed of the sounds from the basement, of Monkey G's finger bending wrong, of number 8 shaking after Carraway gave some new mix. On April 24th, Pinckney made his choice. He waited until Carraway was upstairs attending a teacher meeting, then carefully took several pages from the doctor's working files, descriptions of specific tests, drawings showing the tools used, detailed notes on subjects' reactions. He took only enough to tell the story without leaving obvious holes that would alert Carraway immediately. He wrapped the papers carefully and carried them out of the college that evening, his heart pounding against his ribs with every step. If caught, he would face being kicked out at least, possibly criminal charges for stealing valuable research stuff. He gave the papers to his boarding house owner, Mrs. Elizabeth Simmons, a Quaker widow, who had occasionally shown quiet care for the enslaved people she met. "I need you to get these to someone who can use them," he told her. someone who can make people see what's happening at the college. Mrs. Simmons looked at the papers with growing horror as Pinckney explained what was in them. "Dear God in heaven," she whispered, "this cannot be allowed to go on." She knew exactly who needed to see these papers: Angelina Grimke, a Charleston daughter of a famous family who had moved north and become an abolitionist speaker. Grimke kept quiet letters with several Charleston Quakers, and she had links to Northern newspapers and journals that would eagerly print proof of Southern medical cruelty. But getting papers from Charleston to Philadelphia in 1847 needed careful planning. Mrs. Simmons couldn't simply mail them. All mail was open to checking, and abolitionist papers were routinely taken. Instead, she sent them with a trusted friend traveling north on business, hidden among ordinary letters. The papers reached Grimke in early May. She immediately knew their importance and began working with friendly writers to prepare a story. But journalism moved slowly in the 1840s, and they wanted to check the claims before printing to build a case so strong that even critics would have to admit the truth. Meanwhile, Carraway had noticed the missing pages. At first, he assumed he had simply lost them, but as days passed without finding them, he began to suspect theft. He questioned both students sharply, watching their reactions. Gadsden seemed genuinely confused by the missing stuff. Pinckney's worry, however, was clear. "You wouldn't happen to know where those papers went, would you, Thomas?" Carraway asked coldly one afternoon. "No, sir," Pinckney lied, his voice barely steady. "Perhaps they were lost during cleaning." Carraway's eyes narrowed. Perhaps someone with a weak stomach decided to ruin work they lacked the guts to appreciate. "I'll be watching you very carefully from now on, Mr. Pinckney." The feeling in the lab grew heavier. As Carraway's suspicions grew, he began locking his records in a cabinet and carrying the key with him constantly. He also sped up his experimental timeline, as if sensing that his window of chance might be closing. In late May, he began what he called invasive nerve checks, procedures designed to directly look at nervous system parts. He started with the remaining monkeys, carefully cutting portions of spinal cord to see differences in fiber thickness and layout. 4 more animals died during these procedures, their bodies kept in jars for later detailed study. Carraway announced his plan to perform similar checks on human subjects, though with slightly less harmful ways. Dean Rutledge, growing increasingly nervous about the whole thing, tried to stop him. "Perhaps we have enough data already, Edmund. The board is still reviewing your draft paper, and I think it would be smart to pause new experiments until they give a decision." "Science cannot be paused for office convenience," Carraway replied coldly. "I'm close to absolute proof, Horace. Another few weeks of study, and we'll have proof that will reshape medical education throughout the South." What neither man knew was that events were already moving beyond their control. In Philadelphia, articles about the Charleston Medical College experiments were being set for printing in multiple papers. In Charleston itself, Reverend Brown had quietly written down everything Samuel and others reported, creating a side record of the basement horrors that would prove key in coming weeks. And in the lab, the subjects themselves had begun to understand that time was running out. Whatever was coming next, they knew it would be worse than anything they had endured so far. Dina organized the others as best she could, urging them to remember everything, to survive if possible, to tell what had been done. "We got to live," she told them one night after Carraway had left, her voice fierce despite her tiredness. "Got to live and tell what happened here. That's the only way any of this means something, the only way we can stop him from doing this to others. But surviving would prove more difficult than any of them imagined. The first article appeared in the Philadelphia Public Ledger on June 3, 1008, 147, under the headline, "Horrific Medical Experiments in Charleston College." The report, drawn from Pinckney's stolen papers and added to by Grimke's thoughts, described in clear detail the acts Carraway had performed, the suffering of his subjects, and the fake methods under his claimed findings. The response was fast and explosive. Northern newspapers seized on the story as proof of Southern cruelty, running opinion pieces that blamed not just Carraway, but the entire system of slavery that made such experiments possible. "What kind of society," wrote the editor of the Massachusetts Spy, "allows medical men to treat human beings as lab specimens, to purposely cause suffering in the name of science, to lower people to the moral status of animals?" In Charleston, the reaction was more mixed. Some residents, particularly among the city's small professional class, expressed shock at the news. Others, particularly farm owners and those making money from slavery continuing, defended Carraway as a victim to Northern meddling and abolitionist lies. The Medical College Board of Trustees held an emergency meeting on June 8. Dean Rutledge argued for immediately stopping the study and firing Carraway to limit the damage to the school's name, but several board members, including two famous planters, insisted that the college must not bow to Northern pressure. "Carraway's methods may have been questionable," said James Hamilton, Jr., a board member and former governor, "but his basic idea remains sound. Different races do possess different traits. Any planter can confirm this through daily watching. We must not abandon study simply because abolitionists have used it for political reasons." The deal reached was classically Charleston. The experiments would stop, but Carraway would be allowed to remain on staff, waiting for a formal check. The enslaved subjects would be returned to their owners, and the college would issue a carefully worded statement, neither blaming nor defending the research. This solution satisfied no one. Northern papers continued their attack on Charleston's medical world. Local opinion split along existing lines, and Carraway, sensing that his career hung by a thread, made a desperate choice. On the night of June 11th, he returned to the college alone long after the building had emptied. He needed to finish his work before politics destroyed everything. He needed final absolute proof that would silence all critics by the pure weight of evidence. Marcus, the former blacksmith, was the first subject he picked for what he called terminal nerve examination, a procedure that would allow detailed viewing of nerve structures, but that the subject would not live through. Carraway had fixed the technique on the last monkeys, developing a method to reach the spinal cord and major nerve bundles while keeping them awake long enough to test reactions. What happened next remains argued in the historical record. Carraway's journal entries for that night are broken and blood-stained. Pinckney's later words describe arriving at the college early the following morning to find chaos. And Marcus himself, against all odds, lived to tell his own version of events. According to Marcus' account given years later to abolitionists in Boston, Carraway strapped him to the exam table around midnight. The doctor seemed upset, muttering to himself about proving he was right and scientific truth. He gave a partial numbing drug, enough to dull reactions but not stop consciousness entirely. Then he began the procedure. The pain, Marcus said, beat anything he had experienced in 40 years of life as an enslaved man. He had been whipped, beaten, burned with brands, worked until his hands bled, but nothing compared to the feeling of instruments poking his exposed nerves while Carraway took notes with cold interest. At some point, Marcus couldn't be certain how long, time having become meaningless, Carraway made a mistake. Perhaps tiredness affected his normally steady hand. Perhaps the body parts differed from what he expected based on the animal cuts. Whatever the cause, he cut an artery he had intended to save. Blood sprayed across the doctor's shirt and filled the hole he had created. Marcus felt warmth spreading across his back, felt consciousness fading. Carraway swore and scrambled for ties, suddenly desperate to save a specimen who had been marked for death. The irony would have been funny if Marcus had possessed the strength to laugh. Carraway managed to slow the bleeding, but he had lost control of the procedure. Marcus hung on the edge of consciousness, his body in shock, his survival uncertain. The doctor finally unstrapped him and half-carried, half-dragged him to the recovery area where the other subjects were kept. Dina awoke to find Carraway dropping Marcus' limp form on the floor. "Keep him alive if you can," the doctor said, his voice strange and distant. "I need him alive, the date isn't complete." Then he left, stumbling up the stairs and out of the building, leaving behind a scene that looked like a slaughterhouse. Dina and the others did what they could for Marcus with no supplies, no medical knowledge, only desperate instinct and years of experience patching each other up after punishments. They packed the wound with torn cloth from their own clothing. They kept him warm, they made him drink water when he regained enough awareness to swallow, and somehow, impossibly, Marcus lived through the night. When Pinckney arrived at the college at dawn on June 12th, he found the basement lab in chaos. Blood had pooled on the exam table and trailed across the floor. Cutting tools lay scattered and unwashed, and in the corner, the human subjects huddled around Marcus' unconscious form, protecting him with their own bodies. Pinckney ran to fetch help, his mind spinning. He found Dean Rutledge at the man's home, woke him from breakfast, stammered out what he had found. Rutledge's face went pale. "Where is Dr. Carraway now?" "I don't know, sir. He wasn't at the college when I arrived." They found Carraway in his rooms, still wearing his blood-stained clothes, his hands shaking as he tried to write up his notes from the failed procedure. He seemed barely aware of their presence when Rutledge demanded to know what had happened. "I needed absolute proof," Carraway said, his voice flat. "The critics don't understand. They are blinded by feelings. I needed to show for sure. You have destroyed us," Rutledge interrupted, his own voice harsh with fear and anger. "The board meets this afternoon. There will be consequences, Edmund, severe consequences." Carraway looked up then, and Pinckney saw something broken in his eyes, some break from reality that suggested the doctor might be having a mental collapse. "The data," Carraway whispered. "I must complete the data." He never got the chance. By afternoon, news of the night's events had spread through Charleston's connected networks, medical community, enslaved population, business interests, political groups. The college's trustees had no choice but to act firmly. That evening, they issued a statement announcing the immediate firing of Edmund Carraway, the permanent stop of all research involving human subjects, and a formal investigation into the events of recent months. They expressed regret for any suffering caused and promised complete help with civil authorities should criminal charges be thought about. The civil authorities, however, showed little interest in pressing charges. Carraway had broken no laws that Charleston lawyers could name. The enslaved subjects had been used with their owners' permission for purposes largely consistent with the rental agreements. The fact that some might find the experiments distasteful didn't make them illegal. But the court of public opinion proved harsher than the legal system. Northern papers published increasingly detailed accounts of Carraway's methods, each article more damaging than the last. Medical journals in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York condemned the research as fake science cruelty that shamed the entire job. Even some Southern doctors began to distance themselves from Carraway's work, recognizing that defending it made them targets for abolitionist attacks. The final blow came in late June when Marcus, against all odds, still alive, was interviewed by visiting writers who had traveled to Charleston specifically to record the scandal. His account of the June 11th procedure appeared in papers across the North, accompanied by opinion pieces calling for world medical groups to formally scold Carraway and the medical college. The doctor himself seemed to retreat further from reality as the consequences grew. He refused to leave his rooms, refused to speak with former colleagues, spent his days obsessively reviewing his research records as if he might find in them some proof that the rest of the world refused to see. The formal investigation began on July 2nd in a stuffy room on the college's second floor, far removed from the basement where the experiments had taken place. The Board of Trustees had picked 3 respected Charleston doctors to review Carraway's work and give judgment on both its scientific merit and moral meanings. Pinckney was called to speak first. He described his months assisting with the research, his growing unease, his eventual decision to remove documents from the lab. The panel questioned him sharply about his reasons, his trustworthiness, his potential bias against Carraway. "You stole from your teacher, Doctor," James Moultrie said accusingly. "Why should we trust anything you say when you have proven yourself capable of theft?" "Because what he was doing was wrong," Pinckney replied, his voice steady despite his fear. "I didn't understand that at first. I thought it was just science, just necessary for medical progress. But watching Number, watching Dina, watching Marcus, watching James lose himself entirely, I couldn't pretend anymore that this was defensible." "You let your emotions overcome your professional judgment," Moultrie countered. "A doctor cannot afford such weakness. Then perhaps I am not suited to be a doctor in a system where cruelty is called science," Pinckney said quietly. The room fell silent. That kind of statement in Charleston in 1847 bordered on dangerous radicalism, but before anyone could respond, Dean Rutledge cleared his throat. "Let us focus on the facts of the case rather than deep debates. Mr. Pinckney, describe for us the procedures you witnessed in specific detail." For the next 3 hours, Pinckney provided details that made even the hardened doctors on the panel visibly uncomfortable. He described the pain tests, the chemical exposures, the deliberate creation of injuries to study healing. He explained how Carraway had dismissed any suggestion that his methods might be flawed, how the doctor had seemed to view the subjects as basically non-human. "Did he ever show concern for their welfare?" one panel member asked. "Only as one might worry about keeping lab equipment working," Pinckney replied. He wanted them functional for future experiments. Their suffering itself was merely data to be recorded. Gadsden spoke next, backing up most of what Pinckney had described, though with a more defensive tone. "We were following established scientific rules," he insisted. "Perhaps, Doctor, Carraway's excitement led him too far, but his basic approach was sound. Many doctors conduct research on subjects who cannot consent. Prisoners, the insane, the enslaved. It is a necessary evil for medical progress." And the events of June 11th, the panel chair asked, "Would you call nearly killing a subject through reckless procedure as sound scientific practice?" Gadsden paused. "No, sir. That was something else, something desperate. On the inquiry's third day, several of the test subjects were called to speak. This itself was unusual. Enslaved people's words generally carried no legal weight in South Carolina courts, and having them speak publicly about their experiences risked creating sympathy that might weaken the system of slavery itself. But the panel had decided that understanding exactly what had occurred required hearing from those who had experienced it directly. They allowed Dina, Marcus, and 3 others to speak, though only in response to specific questions, and with warnings that lying would result in severe punishment. Dina spoke first, describing the flow of experiments from her view. She was careful, measured, aware that every word might be used against her or others, but she also refused to minimize what had happened. "He treated us like we wasn't human," she said simply, "like we was things he could cut and burn and poison just to see what happened. And when we screamed, he just wrote it down in his books like it was no different from noting the weather." "Did you at any point agree to take part in these experiments?" a panel member asked. Dina looked at him with something between pity and hate. "Sir, I am property. Ain't no such thing as my consent. My owner rented me to the college, and I could help or be punished." "That ain't consent. That's just different flavors of force." The panel member had no answer to that. Marcus spoke while sitting. He still couldn't stand for long periods without pain radiating from his back. He described the night of June 11th in quiet, factual terms, his voice empty of feeling, but the bare facts were damaging enough. By the time he finished, even Moultrie, who had been most doubting of the subject's words, looked shaken. "Why do you think Dr. Carraway did this?" the panel chair asked. Marcus considered the question. "I think he wanted to prove we wasn't as human as white folk," he said finally. "Wanted science to say what he already believed, that we was different enough that treating us different was natural and right. But he went at it backwards, deciding the answer first and then torturing people to make the evidence fit." That thought, coming from an enslaved man with no formal schooling, struck at the heart of Carraway's failures more exactly than any educated critique could have. The inquiry's final witness was Carraway himself. The panel had debated whether to force his testimony, knowing he would likely be angry and defensive, but they decided the record needed to include his view, his explanation for decisions that seemed increasingly wrong. He entered the room looking tired, his clothes messy, his hands still bearing blood stains he seemed not to notice. He refused to sit, standing before the panel with stiff posture that suggested barely kept control. "Dr. Carraway, explain for the panel the scientific reason for your research," the chair began. "My work was grounded in established rules of comparative body study," Carraway replied, his voice flat. "If different races exist which no thinking person doubts, then documenting those differences serves both scientific understanding and practical use. I used rigorous methods, careful watching, and detailed record keeping. My only error was insufficient political awareness regarding how abolitionist elements would twist my findings." "What about the suffering you caused?" Rutledge asked quietly. 23 human beings subjected to deliberate pain. 4 animals killed. At least 1 human subject nearly killed through reckless procedure. How do you justify that? All medical progress requires sacrifice, Carraway said. Doctors in Paris cut up bodies that were people hours before. Surgeons practice ways that kill some patients to save others later. The enslaved subjects were going to suffer regardless. At least through my research, their suffering added to knowledge rather than being merely accidental to farm work. The reasoning was shocking in its cold logic, its complete lack of admitting that the subjects were human beings whose suffering mattered regardless of any claimed scientific benefit. Do you feel any regret for what you have done? The panel chair asked. Carraway looked at him with genuine confusion. Regret for doing research? Should surgeons feel regret for cutting into patients? Should body experts feel regret for cutting cadavers? I performed necessary work that others lacked the courage to try. The only thing I regret is the political meddling that prevented me from completing a study that might have answered definitively questions that have plagued natural philosophy for centuries. That response effectively sealed his fate. The panel talked for just 2 hours before giving their judgment on July 9th, 147. They found Carraway's research to be methodologically flawed, morally indefensible, and scientifically worthless. They noted that his assumptions about racial differences had poisoned every aspect of his work, rendering his conclusions meaningless regardless of the data collected. They blamed his treatment of test subjects as extreme cruelty serving no real medical purpose, and they recommended permanent firing from the college with a formal suggestion that other medical schools refuse him work. The board of trustees, desperate to contain the scandal's damage to their school, accepted every suggestion. Edmund Carraway was officially fired from the Medical College of South Carolina on July 12, 1847. His name removed from staff lists, his papers taken and sealed in the college archives where they would remain hidden for over a century. But that wasn't quite the end of his story. Carraway left Charleston on a humid August morning, his things packed in 2 trunks, his name destroyed, his career in ruins. He had secured a job through a former coworker at a small country clinic in Georgia, far from major cities and medical centers, where his past might not follow him quite so closely. The enslaved subjects were returned to their owners over the course of July. Some went back to farms, resuming the cruel labor that had shaped their lives before the experiments. Others were sold to new owners, their rental to the college having marked them as difficult or damaged goods that original owners preferred to get rid of. Marcus ended up in the hands of a cloth factory owner who needed workers capable of running machines despite physical limits. He spent the next 13 years working looms in a Columbia mill before the Civil War's chaos allowed him to escape north. Dina was sold to a mobile merchant family where she worked as a house servant until 1865. She would later say that the housework, for all its shame and rules, felt like freedom compared to the months in Carraway's lab. James, the 15-year-old boy who had stopped speaking, never recovered from what he had experienced. He was sold to a turpentine camp in North Carolina where workers died at huge rates. He lasted less than a year before dying of pneumonia in the winter of 1848. His death, recorded only as a line in an account book, property loss, Negro boy, age 16, $400. Thomas Pinckney finished his medical degree despite the scandal, though his role in exposing Carraway's research made him a debated figure in Charleston's medical world. He moved north after graduation, starting a practice in upstate New York, where he became known for treating patients regardless of race with unusual care and respect. He never spoke publicly about his time in the basement lab, but his private letters suggest it haunted him for the rest of his life. The Medical College of South Carolina started new rules stopping experimental research on human subjects without clear oversight. These policies would be quietly ignored within a decade as the demand for medical knowledge and the supply of enslaved subjects proved too tempting a mix for some doctors to resist. Caraway himself practiced medicine in the shadows for another decade. Records show he moved from Georgia to Alabama to Texas, never staying anywhere long, never regaining the school position he had wanted. He died in 1008, 159 in San Antonio of cholera, attended in his final days by a doctor who had no idea about his past. His lab journals and research files remained sealed in the medical college archives, forgotten as the Civil War approached and other concerns ate up the nation's attention. They would stay hidden through Reconstruction, through the Gilded Age, through decades when the questions Caraway had tried to answer through torture were settled through very different means, through the words of formerly enslaved people themselves, through the gathered weight of proof that all humans shared basic likenesses, through the slow moral realization that scientific inquiry could never justify deliberate cruelty. The journals were found again in 1982 during repairs to what had become the Medical University of South Carolina. A construction crew found them in a sealed section of the old basement, kept in the dry darkness for 135 years. A graduate student in medical history researching the school's past recognized their importance immediately. The discovery started a school reckoning. The university organized a meeting on medical ethics, inviting scholars to examine how doctors had explained experimental research on enslaved people, prisoners, the mentally ill, and others deemed expendable by society's standards. They published a formal admission of the 1,147 experiments, naming the known victims and apologizing for the school's role. But the journals themselves revealed something historians found even more disturbing than the experiment's brutality. They showed how easily educated, intelligent people could convince themselves that cruelty served higher purposes, how readily science could be twisted to confirm existing hate, how institutional structures could help rather than stop ethical disasters. In one particularly chilling entry from early April 147, Caraway had written, "The subjects sometimes watch me with looks I might see as fear or hate if I believed them capable of such complex feelings. More likely, I am seeing human feelings in basic animal reactions to pain. This tendency to see human feeling in lesser beings represents one of the main blocks to fair scientific inquiry." Reading that passage 135 years later, researchers understood with stark clarity how Caraway had kept his clinical distance by refusing to recognize the humanity of the people he was torturing, by redefining their suffering as merely animal responses, by hiding behind the language of fairness and scientific rigor while conducting what amounted to detailed exercises in confirming his own hate. The university's ethics meeting ended with several suggestions, teaching medical students about the history of unfair research, setting up strong review boards to prevent future abuses, admitting openly the job's part in slavery-era horrors, and recognizing that ethics could never be separated from science without terrible results. Of the 23 enslaved people who lived through Caraway's experiments, only 3 are known to have lived long enough to give words about their experiences. Marcus, interviewed in 1008, 179, by a historian collecting stories of formerly enslaved people, provided the most detailed account. He was 72 then, still working despite chronic pain from the injury Caraway had caused. "I don't tell many people about the months in Charleston," he said. "Most folks don't want to hear it. Makes them uncomfortable. But I think it's important someone knows what happened, what people are capable of when they decide other people ain't really people." Asked if he had forgiven Caraway, Marcus laughed bitterly. "Forgive? That ain't for me to say. I survived him, that's all I know. Survived when he meant to kill me for his science. That's its own kind of victory, I suppose." Dina, interviewed in 1881, was less accepting. "He was evil," she said simply, "called himself a man of science, but evil is evil regardless what fancy words you dress it in. And the men who let him do it, who rented us out and turned away when we screamed, they was evil too. Wasn't no one monster, was a whole system of monsters, all agreeing that what was happening was fine because it was happening to people like us." The third survivor, a woman named Ruth, who had been number 11 in Caraway's records, refused to discuss the details of what she had experienced. "Some things don't need repeating," she told an interviewer in 1876. "Some things should be forgotten, if that's possible, but I know they won't be forgotten, 'cause the men who did them wrote it all down, made records like they was proud of it. So maybe the memories need to exist, need to stay, so people understand what humans can do to each other when they decide some humans don't count as human." The basement lab where Caraway conducted his experiments was turned into storage space in 1852, then bricked up entirely during repairs in 1889. For decades, no one entering the medical college building knew that beneath their feet lay the stone rooms where 23 people and 12 monkeys had been subjected to organized torture in the name of scientific progress. When the space was finally reopened in 1982, workers found pieces of the lab still in place, rusted tool tables bolted to the floor, cabinet handles from the locked storage where Caraway had kept his records, drain systems designed to handle the fluids of experimental work. One wall bore faint scratches that might have been messages, or might have been random marks impossible to read after so many decades. The university debated what to do with the space. Some wanted to seal it again, arguing that keeping it would serve no purpose beyond morbid curiosity. Others insisted it should become a memorial, a place where visitors could face directly the medical profession's dark history. The deal reached was classically careful. The space was preserved, but not made open to the public. Available only for school groups studying medical ethics, always accompanied by historical context explaining what had occurred there and why it represented a terrible failure of both science and humanity. The question of what to do with Caraway's journals proved even more fought over. Their historical value was undeniable. They provided detailed proof of slavery-era medical experiments that had long been suspected but poorly documented. But publishing them raised ethical concerns. Would making them available merely serve to satisfy dark curiosity? Would detailed descriptions of experimental procedures cause unnecessary pain to descendants of the victims? The university ultimately decided to make the journals available to qualified researchers while stopping public access to summary documents that conveyed the historical facts without the graphic details. Even this compromise satisfied no one entirely, but it reflected a real attempt to balance historical openness with ethical responsibility. What the journals revealed beyond the specific horrors Carraway committed was how completely he had convinced himself that his work served real scientific purposes. His entries showed no awareness that he was simply using methods to justify predecided conclusions, that he was torturing people to confirm what he already believed. He had created a complex structure of watching and measuring that looked like science, but was actually just organized cruelty wearing science's mask. This pattern, the use of scientific language and methods to make hate and abuse look okay, would recur throughout American history. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which black men were purposely left untreated to study disease progress. The forced sterilization programs targeting poor and minority populations. The radiation experiments conducted on unknowing subjects during the Cold War. Each case involved educated professionals convincing themselves and others that harm inflicted on helpless populations served higher purposes. Carraway's experiments represented an early example of this phenomenon, one made possible by slavery's complete lowering of its victims. But they also demonstrated something historians found important, that resistance and witness could survive even the most planned attempts at erasing. Marcus, Dina, Ruth, and others had lived to tell what happened. Pinckney had risked his career to show the horrors. Samuel and the Black Community Network had documented and saved information despite having no official channels for doing so. This resistance, more than the experiments themselves, became the focus of how the Medical University of South Carolina eventually chose to remember the events of 1847. Rather than focusing on Carraway or his fake theories, they created teaching materials that highlighted the humanity and choice of those who had been treated as test subjects, the courage of those who had exposed the scandal, and the long process by which medical ethics grew to prevent similar disasters. For descendants of the 23 people who survived Carraway's lab, learning this history brought mixed feelings. Some found peace in knowing their ancestors' suffering was finally admitted. Others felt anger that it had taken so long for the truth to emerge. All emphasized the importance of understanding that what happened wasn't a single incident, but part of a larger system that had treated enslaved people as property to be used however white owners wished. "My great-great-grandmother was number 7, said a woman who contacted the university after the 1982 discovery made news. "We always knew something terrible happened to her in Charleston, that she had scars and nightmares, that she wouldn't let anyone touch her back. But we didn't know the details until now. Part of me wishes we still didn't know, but another part is glad the truth is out. Glad people can't pretend slavery was just farm work. Glad there's proof of exactly what people will do when they decide some humans aren't human." The Medical University's ethics program eventually added study of the Carraway experiments into required classes for all medical students. They approached it not as historical curiosity, but as a warning story, emphasizing how easily ethical boundaries dissolve when professionals prioritize abstract knowledge over individual human dignity. When institutions fail to provide meaningful oversight, when society creates categories of people deemed unworthy of moral thought, what happened in 1847 wasn't a mistake, one ethics professor told students during a lecture on the topic. It was the logical extension of a system built on dehumanization. Carraway didn't invent the idea that enslaved people could be used however white people wished. He just applied that idea in a medical context. Understanding this history isn't about blaming one doctor from 180 years ago. It's about recognizing the systems and assumptions that made his work possible and examining whether any of those systems and assumptions persist today. That question, whether modern medicine still holds pieces of the thinking that enabled Caraway's experiments, remains subject to active debate. Research continues to reveal gaps in how pain is judged and treated across racial lines. How medical testing still disproportionately affects helpless populations. How the legacy of slavery-era medicine influences modern health care practices. The basement lab itself stands as silent witness to these ongoing questions. The scratches on the wall, which might be messages or might be nothing, have been preserved exactly as found. Sometimes medical students stand in that space during ethics training and try to imagine what occurred there. Try to connect historical horror to modern practice. Try to understand their profession's capacity for both healing and harm. What do you think about this dark chapter of American medical history? Could something like this happen today under different circumstances? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the history of medicine, please share it with others who might benefit from knowing this history. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more deep investigations into America's hidden past and hit that bell so you never miss our journeys into the shadows of history. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that make us most uncomfortable.